Hi. So today, I'll be continuing the discussion. Before we talked about perfect competition. Now, what if there is imperfect competition? What if competition is imperfect? And what does it look like? So imperfect competition prevails in an industry whenever individual sellers can affect the price of their output, right? Recall that in perfect competition, firms are price takers, meaning they don't have any influence at all at the price. They just take as given what the market price is, right? But here, we know that if there's imperfect competition, certain sellers can affect the price. Monopolistic competition. So let me just clarify before going through this diagram. That's closest to perfect competition. There's still large number of firms, just like in perfect competition, but in this particular type of competition, monopolistic, there are slightly differentiated products, right? So perhaps there are other varieties of a particular good, right, being sold by different firms. But then they're just like one category. So for instance, phones, right? And then um, there are different firms who sell phones, but they have like almost or slightly different products, right? That can make these, like for instance, in firm A and firm B, they have cell phones of their own, right? They can be close substitutes as compared to in perfect competition where goods are being sold are homogeneous, meaning buyers will be indifferent between the goods being sold. But here, like they have options even if they're like almost the same but not quite. Now, so as opposed to price takers, right, in the perfect competition, firms in imperfect competition can influence price or can actually dictate what the price is. So on the opposite end, right, opposite of perfect competition, we have monopoly. That means that there's the firm, if it is a monopoly, is the sole seller, and there are no close substitutes. And then moving a bit closer to the spectrum, right? We have oligopoly that involves a few sellers, right? Only few, like a duopoly. Duopoly yeah, has two sellers. Oligopoly more than two, but not as much. So let's continue in describing what imperfect rather competition is. So they have some control over the price, but imperfect competition does not imply that a firm has absolute control over the price. So take the cola market, where Coca-Cola and Pepsi together have the major share of the market, right? I mean, they don't necessarily like say this is the price, no. But then what it means that is that um, competitors, for instance, in the cola market, if they wish to compete against Coca-Cola and Pepsi, of course they have to like go where the market price is that's being sold from Coca-Cola and Pepsi. They have to take that into consideration. Right? So the amount of discretion over price will differ from industry to industry. So of course, remember P equals MR equals MC. That's the um, profit maximizing condition in the perfect competition environment. But here, price may be greater than marginal cost, and we'll know why. So long run economic profits are possible as opposed to the zero economic profit in the long run uh, market equilibrium, right? Perfect market equilibrium. Uh, Economic surplus is being reduced. So we've talked about economic surplus in the previous discussion, and imperfect competition is very common, right? Even here in the Philippines, in the telecoms industry, there are only a few players, right? Now let's determine vis-a-vis perfect to competition, perfect to imperfect. So in perfect competition, supply and demand determine equilibrium price. Um, in perfect competition, the firm has no market power, meaning they don't have the ability to influence. I mean, in a nutshell, that's what market power is. They don't have the ability to dictate what the price should be in the market. At the equilibrium price, the firm sells all it wishes. If the firm raises its price, sales will be zero. That's in a right the entry and exit. The firm's demand curve is the horizontal line at the market price. But with imperfect competition, the firm has some control over price or some market power, and the firm faces a downward sloping demand curve. So we'll see more details later. So here's a graphical representation of each. So remember, in perfect competition, individual firm faces a perfectly elastic demand, right? So meaning like slight changes. Oh, I mean, quantity is the change in quantity is not as well. If you slightly change quantity, if prices shift or changes slightly, quantity will respond more, right? Perfectly elastic. Here, for imperfect competition, the imperfectly competitive firm faces a downward sloping demand curve. So the fact that the demand curve of imperfect competitors slope down has an important implication. So imperfect competitors are price makers, not price takers. They must decide on the price of their product while competitors take the price as a given. So this is an individual firm. So that's the prevailing market price. In a perfect competition, that's the prevailing market price at whatever level of production the firm undertakes. Meanwhile, here, if the firm is an imperfectly competitive firm, so they have like at this level of quantity, this is the price. At this level, at this level of quantity, this is the price, and so on and so forth. So what are the sources, main sources of market imperfections? So number one, industries tend to have fewer sellers when there are significant economies of large-scale production and decreasing costs. So under these conditions, large firms can simply produce more cheaply and then undersell small firms, which can't survive. So economies of scale, we've talked about economies of scale before. Number two, markets tend towards imperfect competition when there are barriers to entry that make it difficult for new competitors to enter an industry. So in some cases, the barriers may arise from laws, regulations, and some other factors which we will discuss in greater detail later on. So the key, right, to cost and market imperfection is whether there are economies of scale, right? So what does that mean? If there are economies of scale, a firm can decrease its average cost by expanding its output at least up to a point. That means bigger firms will have a cost advantage over smaller firms, right? So meaning they can, I remember uh, increasing returns or economies of scale. They can produce, if they increase input, right, by a certain proportion, they get to produce like more than. So for instance, firms increase their production by two times, right? Two times the level of their input, right? They could produce like more than double of their production. So that could allow the firm to decrease its average cost because it's producing, um, well, in the example that I gave, like they're producing more than double, right? So when economies of scale prevail, one or a few firms will expand their outputs to the point where they produce most of the industry's total output. So that's what economies of scale being applied to. I mean, that's a signal, right, or the source of imperfection in the market. So we give further details through a graph. So this shows an industry where there is perfect competition, right? So it shows an industry where the point of minimum average cost is reached at a level of output that is tiny relative to the market, right? So see here, there's a break already, and then this just tells you that market demand is like at a thousands level already, but average cost has already been increased at a certain point before reaching the demand curve, right? So total industry demand, DD, is so vast relative to the efficient scale of a single seller that the market allows viable coexistence of numerous competitors, right? As opposed to here, the intermediate case, remember the spectrum. So now we talk about oligopoly, right? There are few sellers. So here, so take notice of the numbers in the axes, right? In the x-axis here, it shows an industry where firms have minimum average cost at a sizable, right? So they have a big average cost, right? That's what it means. The industry demand curve allows, the industry demand curve allows only a small number of firms to coexist, right? Because the average cost is so the minimum average cost is already huge, right? At this point. So costs turn up at a higher level of output relative to the total industry demand, and coexistence of numerous perfect competitors is impossible, and oligopoly emerge here, right? I mean, average minimum cost is already achieved at like a few level of production, right? As compared to this at 100, that's huge already, the average minimum cost. Now we go to the case of a natural monopoly. We'll talk about more about the natural monopoly later on, but basically a natural monopoly is a market in which the industry's output can be efficiently produced only by a single firm. And again, this is due to economies of scale. So when costs fall rapidly, so here, that's why it's downward sloping, as opposed to this, right? They are U-shaped. But now average cost, marginal cost, they're downward sloping, they decrease, right? So one firm can therefore expand to monopolize an industry. So with perpetual increasing returns to scale, average and marginal costs fall forever, downward sloping. As output grows, the firm rather can charge lower and lower prices and still make a profit since its average cost is falling. Peaceful competitive coexistence is not impossible with this case. So because one large firm is so much more efficient than a collection of small firms. So some important examples of natural monopolies are the local distribution in telephone, electricity, gas, water, as well as long distance links in railroads, highways, and electrical transmission. Now we go to the sources of discussing the sources of market power. So basically, market power is really talking about barriers to entry. And we can give a formal definition to it, market power. So it's a position of economic strength, affording an undertaking the power to behave to an appreciable extent independently of competitors, customers, and consumers at large. Or we could say that it's the ability to act without competitive restraint from its competitors and customers. And it has, well, the most commonly known definition of market power is the ability to raise price over their competitors' prices and still have positive demand. So what are the five major sources of barriers to entry? What gives them market power in essence? Number one, exclusive control over inputs. Right. So inputs again, labor, capital, land, those used to produce output. Next is patents and copyright. So if a firm is given patent, they're the only or copyright, they're the only ones who can produce such kind of output. And then government licenses or franchises, economies of scale, that's what we discussed in natural monopolies, and network economies. So we'll talk about monopoly behavior. This is the only one that's discussed in the lecture, the form of imperfectly competitive firm, right? So Professor Monsod did not discuss any more oligopoly, but so we'll go deeper in discussing monopoly behavior. So why do monopolies arise? So a monopoly, again, is a firm that is the sole seller of a product without close substitutes. And the main cause of monopolies is barriers to entry. So other firms can't enter the market because of these three reasons. Number one, ownership of a key resource. So although exclusive ownership of a key resource is a potential source of monopoly, in practice, monopolies rarely arise because of this reason. So perhaps they're the only ones who have that access to a particular input. I mean, in our language of discussion, right? Next is the government gives a single firm the exclusive right to produce some good. Of course, this is more prevalent, right, than number one. Governments may restrict entry by giving a single firm the exclusive right to sell a particular good in certain markets. So patent and copyright laws are two important examples of how government creates a monopoly to serve the public interest. Right? And number three, cost of production make a single producer more efficient than a larger number of producers. And this is usually the natural monopolies, right? So there are monopolies that are called natural monopolies because they're the only ones who really can provide. I mean, the scale of costs that that you can incur. I mean, if you put it in a competitive setting, is not really so realistic, right? And meaning a single producer has the only right, to become that particular seller because of certain and because of the characteristic that they are efficient, more efficient actually, right, than others. I mean, vis-a-vis a number of firms producing, right? So here, in the case of natural monopoly, so an example is distribution of water or electricity. So public utilities, most of the public utilities are natural monopolies. So to provide water or electricity to town, a firm must build a network of pipes or distribution lines throughout the town. If two or more firms were to compete in the provision of the service, each firm would have to pay the fixed cost of building a network. And that's huge, right? So thus the average cost of providing water is lowest if a single firm instead serves the market. So a natural monopoly arises because it operates, or its operations typically requires a very high overhead or fixed cost and low variable cost. So meaning fixed costs are being paid regardless of level of production, right? So its average total cost thus continually declines as it produces more output. So therefore, it may be inefficient production-wise for two firms, suppose, to incur the same level of high fixed costs and compete in the same market. So the market thus naturally can't support two or more firms in the market. At the same time, average total cost will be lower for both producers and consumers if only one firm provides the service. That's why they're called natural monopolies. So here's an example. Suppose there are 1,000 homes that need electricity. right? So average total cost if is lower if one firm serves all 1,000 homes here than if two firms. So if there are two firms, average cost will be more expensive, right? So when a firm's average total cost curve continually declines, the firm has what's called a natural monopoly. In this case, when production is divided among more firms, each firm produces less in essence, and average total cost rises. As a result, a single firm can produce any given amount at the lowest cost. So here. So this is what would look like. So for instance, if only one firm will produce it, it's more cheaper. Oh, sorry, it's cheaper for that firm for that single firm, right? To provide the output compared to like two or more. So monopoly versus competition. So we now look at how the demand curves look like in both cases. So in a competitive market, the market demand curve slopes downward, right? But the demand curve for any individual firm, remember in our previous discussion, is that it's horizontal because it's a price taker. So the firm can increase quantity without lowering price. So MR equals P for the competitive firm. As opposed to the monopoly, since it's the only seller, it faces the market demand curve. So industry output or the entire output of the market is being served by only one firm. That's why it's downward sloping. So to sell a larger quantity, the firm must reduce price, right? So if a monopolist increases price, consumers buy less. If a monopolist increases quantity, price decreases. So thus, MR is not equivalent to price, right? So the market demand curve provides a constraint on the monopoly's ability to profit from its market power. So a monopolist would prefer if it were possible to charge a high price and sell a large quantity at that high price, but the market demand curve makes that outcome impossible. In particular, the market demand curve describes the combinations of price and quantity that are available to a monopoly. So by adjusting the quantity produced or equivalently the price charged, so the monopolist can choose any point along that demand curve, but it can't choose a point off it. So it's constrained here. So what would the monopolist do? So it all depends. Again, it's universal. Every firm, even if you're a monopolist, your objective is to maximize profit. So we apply again marginal analysis principle, rule number one. We have MR equals MC equals 0, or where the profit maximizing condition for the monopolist is also MR equals MC. However, recall that here marginal revenue is not equivalent to the price anymore, right? So we can show it here, right? So again, we can, a total revenue is price times quantity. We can get average revenue, total revenue over quantity, right? And then we can just cancel because total revenue is price times quantity, so we get P. But marginal revenue in this case is less than P, right? So the monopolist average revenue is the same as the demand curve, right? But the monopolist's marginal revenue is below it. So we'll see a picture, a graph here. So this is the average revenue or the demand curve it faces, but the marginal revenue is below that average revenue. So this is what it looks like for the monopoly. So how is this so? So increasing quantity has two effects on revenue. So if, of course, the monopolist wants to increase output to get more, but we'll see the effects, right? So first is output effect. Higher output raises revenue. We know that, but there's a price effect. If you raise quantity, right? So price is decreasing, right? So that lower price reduces revenue. So to sell a larger quantity, the monopolist must reduce the price on all units, right? It sells. So hence, marginal revenue is less than the price. So marginal revenue could even be negative if the price effect exceeds output effect, right? So why is the marginal revenue curve below the demand curve? So because again, the marginal revenue from monopolies is always less than the price of its good, right? And we have output effect and the price effect. So when a monopoly drops the price to sell more unit, the revenue received from previously sold units also decreases. Right? So MR equals price minus the lost revenue on all previous Q. So here. So there are two opposing effects, right, for the monopoly when it wants to increase Q. Because if it increases Q, it lowers the price. And if it lowers the price, it reduces revenue, right? So that's why the additional output, the additional revenue that the monopolist can obtain from increasing an additional quantity gets smaller, right? So let's look to the profit maximizing condition of the monopoly. So it's also MR equals MC, right? So once the monopolist identifies this, it sets the highest price consumers are willing to pay. So it finds this price from the demand curve. So we have here the demand curve or the average revenue. We have also the marginal revenue, we have the marginal cost, and the average total cost. So remember, the profit maximizing condition for the firm, for the monopolist, is also MR equals MC. So that's the intersection here at point A. Now, the monopolist can influence price, right? So it sets the highest price the consumers are willing to pay. So it doesn't set price at point A, it sets the price at B because that's the highest that the consumer is willing to pay at this level of quantity, which is B. So right, so MR equals MC, find that first and then raise it to the demand curve so that you can obtain the corresponding price, and that's the monopoly price, right? So again, recall that for a monopolist, price is greater than marginal revenue. Right? So hence, for a monopolist at its profit maximizing level of quantity, price is also greater than MC. So recall that competitive firms also choose the quantity of output at which marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So it's just the same with a monopolist. In following this rule for profit maximization, competitive firms and monopolies, right, but apply the same. But there's also an important difference between these two. So for a competitive firm, price is equal to marginal revenue equals marginal cost. But for monopolist, price is greater than marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. So the competitive firm and monopolist have the same condition at which profit is maximized. So that's at MR equals MC. What differs is the relationship of the price to the marginal revenue and cost. So this is crucial. So always remember this for understanding social cost of monopoly. So we'll look at this in greater detail later on. So here's just a side-by-side comparison of a competitive firm and a monopolistic firm, right? So it's still MR equals MC, but the monopolistic firm can raise the price, right, here. So we can also compute for the monopolist's profit. So again, total profit is total revenue minus total cost. And we can equivalently write this to this, right? So I could just divide each by Q and multiply by Q. And this is equivalent. Why? Because if I take this out, 1 over Q, so that cancels and we get total revenue minus total cost as well. That's why I mentioned it's rewrite. And we know the total revenue over quantity is price, right? Or average revenue. But total cost over quantity is average total cost. So that's the profit. So we use this to get the monopolist's profit. So here. So this is the monopoly price minus the average total cost. And you get the area of the square or the rectangle. It's a rectangle. So the monopolist will receive economic profits as long as price is greater than average total cost. So note that for a competitive firm, the competitive firm will also earn economic profits in the short run, right? Short run, as long as this is the case. But long run, there's a zero economic profit, as we discussed in the previous section, right? So I'm just adding so that you can get a glimpse of how different is a competitive firm to a monopolist firm. So we have this figure, on the other hand, in Samuelson. So let's try to break it down so you could grasp how the figures go, right? So this is your graph A, your graph B. Graph A shows you what we've shown earlier, this one, right? So we have the demand curve or average revenue, marginal revenue, marginal cost, average cost, or average total cost are just the same, right? So MR equals MC, that's the profit maximizing condition at point E. Now here in graph B, right? So this shows you the curves, the total revenue, total cost, right? So we know why the curves are as such. And we have the profit curve, right? So at the maximum profit point, you notice that the slopes here, the slopes of the total revenue curve and the slope of the total cost are parallel, meaning they have equal slopes, right? So this just depicts it geometrically. That's why it is just the same. So MR minus MC, so the slopes of the total revenue, the slopes of the total cost is zero because they're parallel, they're the same. And that shows you the maximum profit, right? When we go to the total profit curve, this shows you the maximum level because at this slope, it's neither changing, increasing, or decreasing, right? So it has obtained its maximum. Now there's an arrow here. This shows you the comparison, right? So from the demand curve, marginal cost curves that we've shown earlier, comparing it to how marginal revenue, marginal cost, and total profit curves would look like. How would they correspond to each other? So a monopolist does not have a supply curve. So a supply curve tells us the quantity that firms choose to supply at any given price. So this concept makes sense when we're analyzing competitive firms, right? Because in competitive firms, what determines the price is the demand and supply curves, right? The intersection of it. And then individual firms just take it as a given. But a monopoly, on the other hand, is a price maker. So there's no supply curve there, right? So a competitive firm takes P as a given and therefore has a supply curve. Shows you how its quantity depends on the price. A monopoly firm, on the other hand, is a price maker. So Q does not depend on P. Rather, Q and P are jointly determined by MC and MR and the demand curve. So the shape of the demand curve determines the shape of the marginal revenue curve, which in turn determines the monopolist's profit maximizing quantity. MR equals MC. In a competitive market, each firm's supply decisions can be analyzed without knowing the demand curve. But that is not true in a monopoly market. Therefore, there's no supply curve for the monopoly. Now we discuss about welfare cost of monopoly, right? How do we measure if prices now are being dictated by one firm? One way is to measure in terms of efficiency, as we've discussed in Pareto efficiency in previous discussion. A way to measure efficiency is through the use of economic surplus, as we've delved deeply in the previous discussion, right? So remember, in a competitive market, price equals marginal cost, and the total surplus is maximized. But on the other hand, in the monopoly equilibrium, we have this. Price is greater than the marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Right? So the value to the buyers of an additional unit exceeds the cost of the resources needed to produce that one unit. The monopoly quantity is too low. You could increase total surplus with a larger quantity. So just review the previous discussion why doing so increases total surplus, right? So thus, monopoly results in a dead weight loss. So remember, the socially or the efficient Pareto efficient quantity is where the demand curve intersects the supply curve, where price equals MC, right? So that maximizes this triangle, right? But how about so to understand why monopoly induces welfare loss for society? So suppose price is greater than marginal cost. Suppose we're here. So more consumers are still willing to pay for the good at a price higher than the cost providing it. But at the same time, at price less than marginal cost, the cost of providing to the good exceeds the value of the good to the consumers. So remember the supply curve, that measures the value to the suppliers, producers, right? But at P equals MC, price equals marginal cost, the value of good to consumers equals the cost of providing the good. So that's where total surplus is maximized. So the dead weight loss is a loss in total surplus, basically. The dead weight loss triangle shown in this figure equals the total surplus loss, this one, because of monopoly pricing, right? So if the monopoly price is set by determined by the sole producer, so it increases the price, right? Suppose the price now is here compared to this, where this is determined by competitive firms and atomistic consumers, right? So if it's here, there's a dead weight loss because this does not go anywhere else, right? So we'll discuss in detail. So since a monopoly charges price greater than marginal cost, it places a wedge between consumers' willingness to pay and producers' costs. Not all consumers who are willing to pay for the good at more than its cost get to buy the good. So the monopoly quantity is less than the efficient quantity. There is artificial scarcity. So there's not because of the price increase, right? Remember, price increase has effects on surplus, on consumer surplus, right? There are people who are not willing to buy at that price. So even if there's no scarcity at all, but because price is increased, the loss in the output that can be sold but is not sold, that's an artificial scarcity, right? So in economics, a deadweight loss is a loss of economic efficiency. The welfare cost of a monopoly is due to the monopoly quantity being less than the efficient level as a result of having market power to influence prices, as opposed to a perfectly competitive firm that's a price taker. So the monopoly profit is not necessarily a social problem. Even competitive firms earn profits. Just like any firm, a monopolist is simply maximizing its profits. Profits are powerful incentives for firms to innovate and improve their operations. So the monopoly profit merely represents a bigger slice of the economic pie for producers and a smaller slice for consumers, but not a shrinkage in the size of the pie. That's why it was described as an artificial scarcity. The problem in a monopolized market is that there is inefficiently low quantity of output. The firm produces and sells few below that level that maximizes total surplus. So note that it's not only monopoly pricing that can induce deadweight loss, but also taxes or subsidies, externalities, price ceilings or floors, etc. So now, what are the public policy towards monopolies. Sorry. Why is there a need for public policy? Because again, total surplus is not maximized in a monopolized market. Governments can potentially improve market outcomes, right? So when should markets be left to themselves and when should they be regulated? So what's the criterion? Economic efficiency, equity, and growth, right? So those are the criteria that can be based on whether governments should intervene in the market. In other words, to the extent that government action can improve market outcomes, then it will be beneficial for society, for the government to do something, right? So the goal of public policy towards monopolies is to reduce, if not eliminate, the deadweight loss. Recall that the deadweight loss measures how much the economic pie shrinks as a result of the monopoly. So here are examples of policies that can that responds rather to monopoly situation. So number one, increased competition. So of course we already have the Philippine Competition Act, and that establishes the Philippine Competition Commission, and they're the ones who assess whether a particular industry is it assesses whether the market is already concentrated with only a few sellers, right? Or not. If some actions like mergers, where two firms join together, are desirable because, of course, lower cost or not. Right? Mergers are allowed because of course, economic reason of lowering the costs, right? But sometimes when two firms merge together, then that super firm, where firm A and firm B has already merged, that the shares that they respectively have, of course, that goes to that super firm. And of course, there's already market power in a sense that they have higher the shares are concentrated on that super firm. Another way is to privatize natural monopolies and introduce competition. So an example is the Philippine Airlines that was privatized. Before that was a state-owned. PLDT, power generation, these were before state-owned. Now they were privatized, right? Next is regulation. So of course, regulating prices. So you're reining in on how the prices can go, right, in a particular market. So for a natural monopoly, marginal cost is always less than average total cost. And so you could just read on that. And third is public ownership. So the government can just buy that particular, the government can become the producer of that service or good, right? But of course, there are issues, right? Government failures. That's why economists would usually prefer private ownership, because government failures tend to become greater than the market failures themselves. And lastly, do nothing. When market failure is less than government failure, it may be better to do nothing, right? So remember, there's a distinction between market failure, government failure, as was discussed earlier in the semester. So here's just a summary of the difference between a perfect competition and monopoly. So remember, the individual firm is faced by a horizontal demand curve, right? Because it's a price taker, right? As opposed to the monopoly where it faces a downward sloping demand curve. Profit maximizing, it's still the same. It's still MR equals MC, but it differs when we relate price to this profit maximizing condition. For the perfect competition, it's price greater than is equal to marginal revenue, marginal cost. That's for the perfect competition. On the other hand, for monopoly, price is greater than marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So the supply curve for the perfect competition is the marginal cost curve. For the monopoly, there's no supply curve because, again, monopolists are price makers. Long run equilibrium, there's zero economic profit. But for monopolists, they can obtain positive profits as long as price is greater than average total cost. Efficiency, perfect competition maximizes total surplus, but due to monopoly pricing, on the other hand, there's deadweight loss, as we've discussed earlier. And lastly, what's the public policy for perfect competition? If there's no market failures, or if market failures are less than government failures, then do nothing, right? Let the markets be. So, but on the other hand, if there's some factors that attribute to the rise of monopoly, the government can just do the following, policy responses to address the efficiency, and more importantly, of course, probably some equitable issues as well, because, for instance, price affects the welfare of individuals, of consumers, right? Even the most marginalized peoples are affected by the price increases. So the regulators can regulate the price in that matter. Okay, so that ends the discussion on imperfect competition. So we've from perfect competition, we've moved to how an imperfect competition looks like and how a monopoly behaves, right? If that monopoly is sole seller in the market, right? So just read on the lecture notes again, read the books, and hopefully answer the exercises, and you'll do fine in the exam. So thanks.